Coming up on today's programme, Hamza Yousaf resigns as Scotland's First Minister.
I am not willing to trade my values and principles or do deals with whomever simply for retaining power.
Last week he kicked the Scottish Greens out of government. He's been in trouble ever since. We'll speak to the former SNP leader in Westminster. Also today, Rishi Sunak had seemed to smooth out Anglo-Irish relations, but has the Rwanda policy heightened tensions once again?
Our economic plan is working, that confidence is returning across the country.
A tough week ahead for the Prime Minister. Will he definitely lead his party into the next election? To discuss all that, I'm joined by Conservative peer and journalist Danny Finkelstein, Labour MP Alex Davies-Jones, Reform UK leader Richard Tice and Guardian political editor Pippa Crerar. This is Politics Live. We'll also be joined by the renowned social psychologist Jonathan Haidt about smartphones and what impact they've had on a generation of school children. But first of all, let's return to the breaking news that's happened literally in the last few minutes in Edinburgh. Hamza Yousaf, as you heard there, the First Minister, has resigned that position. He was facing 2 votes of no confidence, one in his leadership and one in the Scottish SNP government. It comes days, as you heard, after booting out his coalition partners, the Greens. He said he was 100% confident last week he would win the votes and remain as First Minister, but over the weekend, when it was clear the numbers just didn't add up, he decided to quit and jump before perhaps he was pushed. Let's have a listen.
Last week, I stood here to announce the ending of the cooperation agreement between the SNP and the Greens, the Butte House Agreement, and that the SNP would seek to govern as a minority government. I made that decision as leader of the SNP as I believed ending the Butte House Agreement was the right one for the party I lead, and I still do believe that to be the case. But most importantly, I believe it was the right decision for the country. My hope was to continue working with the Greens in a less formal arrangement as the SNP moved into a new phase of minority government. Unfortunately, in ending the Butte House Agreement in the manner that I did, I clearly underestimated the level of hurt and upset that caused Green colleagues. For a minority government to be able to govern effectively and efficiently, trust when working with the opposition is clearly fundamental. And while a route through this week's motion of no confidence was absolutely possible, I am not willing to trade my values and principles or do deals with whomever simply for retaining power. Therefore, after spending the weekend reflecting on what is best for my party, for the government and for the country I lead, I've concluded that repairing our relationship across the political divide can only be done with someone else at the helm. I have therefore informed the SNP's National Secretary of my intention to stand down as party leader and ask that she commences a leadership contest for my replacement as soon as possible. In order to ensure a smooth and orderly transition, it is my intention to continue as First Minister until my successor has been elected, particularly as the Parliament will be debating some incredibly important legislation in the coming days and the coming weeks.
Hamza Yousaf there and resigning as First Minister. Let's talk to Ian Blackford, former SNP leader at Westminster, who backed Hamza Yousaf in the leadership contest to replace Nicola Sturgeon. Ian Blackford, your reaction first of all?
Well, good afternoon, Jo. It's a very sad afternoon. I thought that was a exceedingly dignified resignation speech from Hamza Yousaf, and I'm so sorry that it's come to this, that he's felt that he's had to go. I understand the reasons why he has done that, and I think he's, sad to say, done the right thing. But, you know, Humza is a very decent man, a man of empathy. I think a man of tremendous depth who did have what it takes in order to lead Scotland. But we are now where we are, and we move on. And I think in doing so, thank him for all that he's done in his time that he has been our leader.
It was a massive miscalculation, wasn't it, kicking out the Greens? I mean, I was sitting here last Thursday talking to the co-leader of the Greens, Lorna Slater. Her anger and upset and fury about it was palpable. I mean, he made a huge mistake, didn't he?
I understand why Humza did what he did last week. I regret that it's played out the way that it has. Obviously, we need to reflect on the fact that we are a Parliament of minorities. As you know, Jo, we have a PR system to the Scottish Parliament, and we need to work on a consensual basis and a collective basis with others. And I think this has been a misstep by Hamza Yousaf. It's terribly sad that that has been the case. But now we need to think about all the challenges that we face as a party, as a government, as a country. Obviously, a lot of this has been around our climate change ambitions to get to net zero by 2045, the desire to deliver that fairer Scotland that we all wish to see. Humza spoke about his values in his own interview, but crucially also about making sure that we can deliver sustainable economic growth, that we can deliver hope and prosperity to people.
Well, that's looking obviously less likely in terms of the SNP. I mean, he said not willing to trade my values in order to hold on to power. I mean, the truth is he wasn't going to be able to hold on to power because he hadn't counted clearly, even under the system that you've just outlined. So he jumped before he was pushed.
Not necessarily, Jo. I think it is possible he still could have won that vote this week, but I suppose you would ask the question, at what price? The point is that he has done the right thing because he's acted, I think, in both the interests of the party, the government and the country, and it's a question of who can come forward to lead us, recognise the challenges that we face and can build alliances across the chamber so we can get on with the important work of governing in the best interest of the people of Scotland.
Right, you say the best interest. Do you think the SNP was losing its way? It lost its way under Hamza Yousaf and that agreement with the Greens when it came to what turned out to be unachievable climate change targets and also unpopular policies in the country over gender identity?
Well, you know, I think when we reflect on all of that, and I think recognising the challenges that he faced when he became First Minister, but when we talk about these climate challenges, let's not forget that it was the Parliament that voted to put in place those targets. Many people wanted to go further than the SNP. We need to work across the chamber and to make sure that we deliver on those commitments. But of course, much of this is reserved. We need to also make sure that we're doing that with our colleagues in Westminster as well. Right. But let's not forget, Jo, that there's an enormous opportunity from that green transition. We're talking about a five-fold increase in the potential green energy output of Scotland, driving in investment and jobs,
but you dropped,
having that better future.
But those targets were dropped. I mean, who would you like to see? Who would you like to see take over now? Who would be best for the SNP?
I'll answer that, but of course it's the target for 2030 that's been dropped. What we need to make sure is we deliver on net zero by 2045. Yeah, there's been much talk today about potential candidates. I know that John Swinney, the previous deputy leader, has indicated that he may well indeed put his name forward. I would encourage John to do so for a whole host of reasons, because of the type of person he is, as someone that can build support not just in the party but across Parliament and across the country, someone with a depth and breadth of experience in government. And I think at a time like this, to see someone like John that's prepared to put his hat in the ring is something that I would strongly welcome.
And have you spoken to him?
I've spoken to John over the course of the last couple of days, yes, as I speak to many people in the party, and let's wait and see what happens. But I know that John has what it takes to show the leadership, not just to provide stability, but to take the party and to take the country forward. All
right, Ian, will you stay with us there, since it's dry and sunny there on College Green, and we'll bring in our other guests. First of all, Pippa, I mean, what do you make of it all? The collapse, really, in terms of Hamza Yousaf's leadership, short leadership, just over a year. He's been plagued and beset by problems. You know, where does it leave the party?
He's had a very difficult time, hasn't he? Both with the ongoing police investigation into the SNP's finances, the drama that his predecessor Nicola Sturgeon and her husband Peter Murrell ended up caught up in, and of course this pounding at the polls that has happened over the last year in Scotland, with the SNP really sort of plummeting from its once untouchable lofty heights, so it seemed, to a position where now they're being, you know, their ankles are being snapped by the Labour Party and others north of the border. Most recently, though, of course, it was the decision by Hamza Yousaf to dump the Greens before they dumped him. They were, of course, considering holding their own internal vote on the Butte House Agreement, a coalition agreement, partly over the climate targets, which you've mentioned, but also on NHS Scotland decision to pause puberty blockers after the Cass review, both of which went down really badly with the Green coalition partners. And in order to head that off at the pass, Hamza Yousaf decided to pull out of the agreement himself. And as we've seen over the last few days, that has ended up in a position where he recognises he's not able to maintain the confidence of enough voters, enough support in the Scottish Parliament to be able to stay on as First Minister.
I mean, Danny, we've just heard Pippa talking about the polls for the SNP, and they've been going down and closing the gap, certainly with Labour, and I'll ask Alex about that. Why aren't the Tories doing better in Scotland?
I mean, I come from Pinner. I actually literally don't know, and it's very important to say that at the beginning.
Pinner's not near Scotland.
No,
I
can comment on the general political principles at play here rather than specific Scottish matters with any confidence. First of all, if you've been in power for a long time, you begin to lose support. That's definitely happening in the rest of Britain to the Conservatives, and it's happening to the SNP. Secondly, I remember George Osborne saying to me immediately after the Tories did a deal with the Liberal Democrats, he said to me, there's no such thing as a minority government. In other words, you have to actually assemble a majority in a parliamentary system of any kind, including the Scottish system, to be able to pass legislation. Even if you govern by yourself, you have to have clear allies locked in by some sort of agreement. How he could have thought he would walk away from that, I really just cannot understand. So it seems to me they're suffering from things that I don't need a specialist Scottish knowledge to be able to analyse. This was an extraordinary act of inept leadership. Until then, I'd been quite impressed when I saw Hamza Yousaf. I didn't understand why people called him Hamza the Useless, but this was actually pretty useless, like walking away from your deal in the way that he did without any alternative to it. And secondly, they're suffering from the inevitable thing that happens in politics. If you govern for a long time, you begin to go off, and that's what's happened.
Right. I mean, Labour will no doubt hope, and probably will be, the great beneficiaries from this. But actually, just before I ask you, Alex, what happens to the vote of no confidence in the administration itself? Labour, could they still go ahead with that?
I think we'd need to check with people who are closer to the ground than me, but yes, it's a possibility, because, of course, there was two votes. There was one in his leadership, which goes away, and there was one in the administration as well.
Well, would you like to see that go ahead?
I think I would, because I think the people of Scotland deserve better. I think the only way out of this is to call an election in Scotland. You've got utter chaos, instability and incompetence, quite frankly, from the SNPs in Scotland and the Greens talking amongst themselves. You've got politicians fighting amongst themselves while you've got businesses desperate for leadership. You've got people struggling with the cost of living crisis. 1 in 6 people in Scotland on an NHS waiting list. And meanwhile, they're just fighting amongst themselves, bickering over independence when the people of Scotland deserve far better.
Well, Ian, would you like to respond to that? Because there is this other vote of no confidence in the administration.
Well, I think when we reflect on what has happened with Humza's leadership, and I think we have to acknowledge in particular that we've had no strikes in the National Health Service in Scotland. He deserves enormous credit for how he has navigated Scotland through that. NHS has remained at work in Scotland, very different from Wales and England. And of course, I think the leadership that he's given over Gaza and the Middle East. So I'm proud of the achievements of Hamza Yousaf, and of course the fact that we've taken 100,000 young people out of poverty with the child payment. So there are many things that we can reflect on about the strength of his leadership. Thank him for what he's done. We will make sure that we're on side with the people of Scotland, that we have an administration, that we work across the chamber, that we've got a programme for government, we put Scotland back to work and we drive that investment into the green economy. That's what we will offer.
Richard, the Reform Party is less popular in Scotland than it is in England. Why is that?
Good question. I mean, Scotland seems to be obsessed at the moment, particularly under the SNP, on issues that actually most people are not concerned about, which is this gender issue, which has caused huge problems. The hate crime issue has caused huge problems for them. If they'd focused actually on looking after running the NHS properly, running the education system properly, they'd be in a much better state. They're in complete chaos. Frankly, I can't see any other alternative two elections, as Alex rightly says.
Right. I mean, although, Alex, when it comes to the gender identity issues and gender recognition that Richard has mentioned, and so did Pippa, the Labour leader in Scotland, Anna Sarwar, was in agreement over that issue. Now, I know he's changed his mind. Yes, he has had a Damascene conversion, it seems. But at the time, he was very much in support of that. So is he also part of the incompetence that you were talking about?
I think politics is a journey, as you've said. You know, Anas has come around. He's seen sort of the strength of feeling locally. We've looked at the consultations. We've looked at the legislation that was incompatible. And it is about listening to the people of Scotland. And that's what, sadly, is not happening right now.
Well, let's just put this to you. I hope you can still hear me, Ian. Joanna Cherry, an SNP colleague, has tweeted and said, if there is to be healing of hurt and upset, it must start with the electorate, who are not the hateful bigots they are sometimes painted, particularly women's rights activists. It must also take place within the SNP. I will support a leader who recognises this. Do you agree with Joanna?
What we've always done as a party, as a government, is respected the rights of everybody in society. And
Well,
when we talk
she doesn't think that.
Well, you know, when we talk about the GRR, let's not forget that that was supported not just by the SNP, but by the Labour Party, by the Liberal Democrats, by the Greens, and even some Tories. Let's not forget that Theresa May supported similar legislation in the UK as well. These are important issues, and the rights of trans people have to be respected along with the rights of everyone else. I'm really proud of the liberal society that we have, the long journey that we've been on through the long period of devolution, the 25 years of the Scottish Parliament, and the fact that we elected a Scots Asian as our First Minister. There's much to celebrate.
Ian Blackford, thank you very much for joining us. Let's have a look at this headline on a completely different subject in the BBC, and it is on Rwanda. Hopefully it'll come up in a moment. The Rwanda policy, it says, UK and Irish ministers to meet as tensions grow over asylum seekers. Yes, this is because of asylum seekers fleeing across the border from Northern Ireland, or it's reported to be so, into Ireland following the passing of the Rwanda bill. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has said that's evidence that it's working as a deterrent. And he was asked about this on Sunday morning with Trevor Phillips on Sky. Let's have a listen.
Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister says that many of the people who are coming across in these boats are finding their way into Ireland. Are we simply exporting the problem now? Is that the deterrent?
Well, my focus is on the United Kingdom and securing our borders. But what that comment illustrates is a couple of things. One, that illegal migration is a global challenge, which is why you're seeing multiple countries talk about doing third country partnerships, looking at novel ways to solve this problem, and I believe will follow where the UK has led. But what it also shows, I think, is that the deterrent is, according to your comment, already having an impact, because people are worried about coming here, and that demonstrates exactly what I'm saying.
Danny, is it working as a deterrent, the Rwanda bill, already?
You can't say that with confidence at this point. I am in favour of the third-party country agreements. As it happens, I wasn't in favour of doing it with Rwanda, and I had particular problems with the safety of Rwanda bill for legal reasons. However, this problem with Ireland illustrates that the issue of asylum and immigration has to be settled internationally. How Ireland can seriously advocate that they can return people who go to that country when Britain can't return the same people to France. I mean, it boggles the imagination that they can make that argument. So clearly we have to settle this partly with the EU and partly globally as to what we are willing to offer people who are fleeing countries with problems, and also what we're willing to do to make those countries safer so that people don't become refugees. I mean, my grandfather was a refugee. He didn't want to be one. He wanted to live in the country he was born in. And you know, what Britain ended up doing on that, in that occasion, was actually fighting a war to allow him to do that. Right? In other words, Britain had a forward international policy, either of aid or militarily, designed to prevent people becoming refugees in the first place. And we don't often talk about that part of it. So we think of this as merely a kind of left issue. How can we open our borders as much as possible, and not what it also is, which is a conservative issue. How do we project ourselves internationally to prevent these countries declining in such a way that people need to leave them?
Do you agree?
I think it just shows the utter chaos that we've got, and we need a proper plan. We can't just rely on gimmicks that cost £500 million.
So you don't agree with any third country being used to process asylum claims?
What we need, Jo, is an actual plan to tackle this. It's not going to be a gimmick that, as I've said, is costing £2 million per... I can tell you exactly what we would do. We have got a 5-point plan to do this. It is working collaboratively with other countries to smash the gangs, actually going after those people smugglers.
The Tories have been trying that, the French have been trying that, it doesn't work.
Well, it can work if you do it collaboratively. It doesn't work.
The evidence is already there.
It was the UK government that ripped up the Dublin Agreement with Ireland, who are now saying that they are seeing some issues from this. It's working with France, with Belgium, with Dublin, with other countries across Europe to actually tackle this. It's recruiting more people to process the backlog so that we've got asylum asylum claims actually being processed in a timely manner. It's stopping relying on hotels. £8 million a day of taxpayers' money is being spent on hotel use in this country. It's about actually working to solve the problem, rather than just throwing money at the wall and hoping something sticks.
How would you stop the boats?
It's very simple. You've got to pick them up and take people safely back to France, which we're legally entitled to do under 2 international treaties. We know it works. Belgium's doing it, which is why no boats are leaving the Belgian shores. We know it works. The Greeks are doing it. A variant of that is what Australia did. The irony of Ireland saying that we need to take back their asylum seekers who've gone across that border, but not suggesting that actually the blame is with France, is unbelievable. Fine, it's a simple deal to do. We'll take all theirs back. And then France can take
Richard,
back
can I just ask a question?
Of ours.
It's a genuine question as opposed to a pointed one. Given that the British wish to send people back to France and you claim it's legally possible, why are the government's lawyers and its advisors saying that they can't do that?
Because the British leadership and the British government doesn't want to do that. That's why they're not doing it.
Of course it does, though.
Well, it's clearly not showing the leadership. The Australians did it 11 years ago. They took some international flack, but guess what? It stopped the boats. 10 years later, all governments of any party in Australia are continuing that policy. Richard, it works. We're legally entitled
No, but hang on. But Richard, Danny is right in terms of why haven't they done it if it is legally possible? Well, that's because, according to all sorts of research and lawyers who are experts in maritime law, it isn't legal. It isn't legal. I'm just going to put it there.
I disagree. My own lawyers have advised me.
But let me state.
Lawyers can argue
Richard, let me just state what they may be able to. I'm sure they do. But let me just state what is clear from both BBC Verify and from maritime lawyers. And firstly, in Australia, says they did have agreements with the islands that you talked about. The biggest problem here, from the House of Commons Library briefing from 2021, is you need to have the consent of the country you are returning people to. Now, we don't have...
not the case legally. I've read the laws. France is in breach of the international maritime agreements.
You can take France, then, to court. But in terms of the way it stands now, Article 25 of the Convention... is it?
Yes, it is.
We're arguing here about whether it's
is the critical
legal.
requirement and obligation of a government.
All right, let me just read the line. It says, any return of a vessel to a state's territorial waters would require that state's consent. They also go on to say that you need the consent of the people who are in the boat. And if they disagree, then it is dangerous and reckless to pursue.
It's common sense, Richard. Everyone knows it's common sense that everyone wants to be able to return people who come from France to France if they're...
And that is the international law, that people will not...
They
will not show the leadership to do it. France is in breach of its obligations. The safe thing to do to stop the deaths. The current scenario is people are dying. Under the current scenario.
I understand
and yet everybody wants to continue the current scenario.
I accept that. I'm just saying that your legal position is quite niche. It's not agreed with. It's not the mainstream legal position. It's clearly not the government's. It's clearly not the government's legal.
Some proper leadership.
It's not about just about leadership. It's
about leadership.
No, simply saying, you and your entire corporation may believe that it's legal, but the fact is that government lawyers and mainstream legal opinion doesn't agree with you. It's not about leadership, it's about judgment.
Right, the government was looking at a version of your idea back in 2021 when Priti Patel was Home Secretary, and the French government rejected it in the starkest terms. You may think they're wrong, but they did reject it. They said intercepting boats in the sea when they don't want to be escorted is extremely dangerous. It risks the channel becoming a new theatre of human tragedies. So even if you think it's safe, if your partner in this, the state to which you want to return people who make that crossing, doesn't agree, what do you do?
What the Belgian authorities would do. If the French did what the Belgian authorities would do, which was immediately pick people up as soon as they left the shores, guess what? The whole business model is flawed, and that's right. The French are failing in their international obligations under the UN Convention of Law at Sea 1982, under the Safety of Life at Sea 1974. They should be sued, frankly, by the British government until they comply with their obligations.
All right.
That's what leadership is about. No one else has got the guts to do it and to save lives.
Right.
Our policy will save lives.
When it comes to the deterrent factor, as you heard Rishi Sunak there, Pippa, talking to Trevor Phillips about, how much is this helping him stave off a right-wing rebellion?
Well, he'd be hoping that it's part of the answer. Though, of course, the right to the Conservative Party is not just angling over tougher migration law. They've got a whole list of issues that they want him to go further, faster on. As we saw over the weekend, the latest iteration of this, they've got the Tory right currently has 5 pledges they want the Prime Minister to
well, we can
deliver
just
on.
show you this headline in the Sunday Telegraph. Tory rebels on warpath after MP defects to Labour. This is following the news that Dan Poulter, former Conservative MP, had said he was going over to the Labour Party because of the state of the NHS.
Yeah, and what's interesting on the migration issue as well is that it's not the whole Conservative Party. I mean, I was very struck last week by David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, of course, who delivered the Brexit referendum, saying that since Brexit, having a return agreement with France was just not possible. Simply not possible. He is, of course, the Foreign Secretary, so you'd think that he would know what the government's position is. But clearly, Rishi Sunak, this is one of his 5 pledges when he became Tory leader, when he became Prime Minister, that he would stop the boats. Last month, we saw a record number of boats coming over. I think it's 7,000 people. Before the numbers passed 7,000 before the end of April for the first time. So far, it's a problem which is growing. As Danny rightly says, it's too soon to say whether the situation in Ireland is because people are regarding it as a deterrent. That will take time. I think the Prime Minister's problem is that he doesn't have time on his side. And if, as we expect, there's an election this autumn, will there be enough of a dramatic change in the numbers coming over for him to be able to claim a limited degree of success? Or will the public buy it if he says he can at least point to action? We're trying to do something about it, even if we're not getting results yet. And we don't know the answer to that at this point.
Right, what do you think will happen after the local elections on Thursday? That's being seen as a flashpoint, Danny. I mean, we don't know, obviously, what's going to happen, but it doesn't look great for the Conservatives, and you've got some important mayoral contests going on at the same time. Do you think any of this is enough to keep Rishi Sunak in post as Prime Minister till the next election?
So my judgment, this is not a judgment about what I think should happen, but my judgment about what I think will happen. My judgment is he will fight the next general election as the leader of the Conservative Party. I think I think the sensible thing to do, so this is my opinion now, would be for the Conservative Party to keep him in post. But the Conservative Party neither generally follows my opinion nor does what I think to be sensible. So it might not do this. And I think you've got to look at it and think it's quite possible that there'll be a challenge that will reach the threshold. Challenge him, but I think in those circumstances he would retain the confidence of the party, and that probably will also be the judgment of the rebels themselves. So they'll try not to reach that level. It's hard to be sure because when a party is in a position where it looks strongly like it's going to lose the election, everybody has got the capacity to defect. Richard is an example of that. Right? He's gone to the point of thinking it worthwhile setting up his own party rather than being inside the Conservative coalition. So you can see that everyone has the sort of incentive to defect, and clearly that's going to continue if the Conservative body doesn't do well. It's hard to predict in those circumstances how bad it'll get, but my guess is that he'll be the leader at the next general election.
I mean, how worried do you think Tory MPs are about any influence of reform?
Well, I think that of course, if reform is getting 13% or so, unless you pursue the Cameron strategy, which, as everyone knows, is my view, and you therefore try and win a general election by winning votes from the centre, of course, the fact that reform gets 13% is a real problem.
Well, but what about the issues? More money for defence, Rishi Sunak has announced. He has certainly come out with tough rhetoric on what he calls the sick note culture. He is now saying that this is a deterrent. We don't need to go over and rehash the arguments we have just had on asylum and Rwanda. That could put pressure on you if people think, well, actually, the Tory government under Rishi Sunak is doing the sorts of things that we might have expected from you.
He's obviously been reading our contract with the people that's on our website because he's copying our policies.
Let's not go that far.
The truth is, the reality is that no one believes a word that this government says. The country is broken. Everybody knows that, and that's why they're going to get an absolute annihilation this week.
But you agree with increased spending on defence?
Yes, but it's not fast enough, and no one believes that they'll do it because we've heard all this stuff before, and they never ever do it. Whether it's on defence spending, whether it's on leaving the ECHR, all these things, they talk the talk. They never walk the walk, and that's why they're rightly going to be thrown out. That's why we're going up in the polls.
Well, is there any truth in talks of plots?
So I think there's individuals on the right of the Tory party that quite like the idea of taking over from Rishi Sunak, but for the majority of them, it's after the election. They don't see it as being, for the reasons Danny set out, don't see it as being necessarily a helpful path to take this side of an election. But they do want to. They can't help themselves from causing mischief, as far as I can make out. And they're people like Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, Grant Shapps, Penny Mordaunt. And even if the individuals themselves say, we're on board, we're behind the Prime Minister, they certainly all have people behind them that think actually they want to try and capitalise on what they regard as the Prime Minister's weakness. So I think you speak to the majority of Conservative MPs, and I mean the overwhelming majority of Tory MPs, and they think that it would be a ridiculous idea to try and get rid of Rishi Sunak now. That's not saying that they're happy with the situation. That's not saying that they think that things are going brilliantly, but they think it would be a whole lot worse should they have yet another leadership contest, potentially another leader, or the sort of threat that Number 10 seems to be putting out there at the moment of another election sooner than they're ready for it.
Right, so the election will be in the autumn, the second half of the year, which I know technically could be July, but it'll be in the autumn.
I think, can we just recognise how utterly frustrating this is for people across the country to have politicians yet again fighting amongst themselves, talking about replacing our unelected Prime Minister with yet another unelected Prime Minister, potentially, of the leader of the Conservative Party. You've got chaos in Scotland and people just desperately wanting to get support from their political leaders. It is absolutely unacceptable.
All right, but you can't do anything about it, of course. Yes, just briefly.
Can I just dispute? This is also a talking point on the right, this idea the Prime Minister is unelected. Gordon Brown wasn't unelected. He was the leader of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party had a parliamentary majority.
He didn't call him.
And he also didn't call an election. But I would never have called him an unelected Prime Minister because we have a parliamentary system. This idea that the Prime Minister must be directly elected. So I'm not abroad to disagree.
I kind of agree with you. I think you can replace your leader once. How many times have we done that?
All right, Alex, you've got a point.
I do completely agree.
Let's introduce the eminent social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, who's written The Anxious Generation, and talk about smartphones and their impact on a generation of children. Welcome to you, Jonathan. Have we failed a generation of children in terms of protecting them from the consequences of technology and the online world?
Yes, absolutely. Across the developed world, we have failed them. Now, we didn't know what we were doing. Between 2010 and 2015 is when everything changed. In 2010, very few kids had a smartphone. They didn't have social media on their smartphone. In 2015, everyone had that. In your country, in mine, in the United States. And back then, we were all techno-optimists. We thought, the internet's amazing, smartphones are amazing, the internet's going to take down all these dictators. So we didn't really mind when our kids stopped doing things in the real world and began spending all their time on screens. But by the end of the 2010s, it was clear across all the English-speaking countries and across most of the developed world, there's been a huge increase in anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide. And the self-harm and anxiety has hit the girls hardest. And there's no other explanation, and there's plenty of evidence now linking the phone-based childhood to that epidemic.
Right. What should we do about it?
There's an old vaudeville joke. The guy goes to the doctor and he says, "Doctor, it hurts when I do this." And he moves his arm in a funny way. And the doctor says, "Well, stop doing this." And we basically have taken childhood away from our kids. We put them on screens, and we need to stop that. So what I'm proposing in the book is 4 simple norms that we can do. In my country, I don't expect ever to get help from our Congress. So 4 norms we can do even without legislative help, although legislation would help. No smartphone before 16, or before the end of secondary school would be the equivalent here in the UK is what you should aim for. No social media before 16. Phone-free schools, the phones need to be locked up during the day, and far more free play, independence, and responsibility in the real world. If we're going to take away most of the screen time from little kids, mid-childhood, we need to give them back a normal human childhood where they're hanging out with each other, outside, playing and learning how to be self-governing.
Jonathan, do you think the primary responsibility for carrying out those 4 major changes lies with parents or the state?
Well, before I can answer that, I have to make clear why we're stuck here is because the tech companies have put us in a collective action problem. So most parents are freaked out by this. They hate what's happening. But any parent who says, no, dear, you're not going to get a smartphone and social media, you're going to be the only one without it, you're going to be isolated and ostracized. That's the situation that parents have been in. That is not their fault. That is not their responsibility. That is a trap that was created by the companies long ago, so that by the time kids get to the age of 10 or 11, everyone else is on social media. So the primary responsibility for breaking up the trap, I think, rests with government to force the tech companies to check ages, at least enforce the minimum existing age of 13, which is way too low, but there's no enforcement of that. So we need government help, especially on age verification. But yet, because it's a collective action problem, if we act collectively, we parents can do it without the government. Now, it'll really help to have backup. And British parents are doing it. This is what's so exciting. I'm spending the week in London, and you already have parents' movements rising up in arms. Smartphone-free childhood, delay smartphones. You have a bunch of great organizations. Parents are actually up in arms.
Jonathan, I'm going to bring in the rest of the panel. Danny, do you agree with the solution?
Well, the first thing is I've got to satisfy myself, and I haven't yet, with the data that the professor has produced. But so far, I am quite convinced. I think that I've read some of the Substack posts, and I did find them pretty convincing. I started as a techno-optimist. I also wouldn't be generally for the nanny state, but each step of the argument you put, I do find quite convincing. So, despite the fact that it'd be against my initial inclinations. Actually, more broadly, I am quite concerned about the effect of social media in general on both our political culture and on our mental health. My blithe assumptions that these things would always work out for the best of all possible worlds don't seem to be correct.
Right. I mean, it feels like a real crisis when it's sort of put as starkly as Jonathan has said. Never mind my own experiences with having children who are a little bit older. Can you put the genie back in the bottle? Perhaps that's not what Jonathan is suggesting, but can you do that, Alex?
Well, it isn't that simple, is it, Jo? As you've just said, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And there is a role for legislators to take here. We tried to do this in the UK with the Online Safety Act. Sadly, we are still having that huge delay of Ofcom, who will be the regulator, to look at this, to regulate, to actually hold the platforms to account for the harm that is being perpetuated on those platforms. But I would also say that tech can be used for good here. You know, we talk a lot about how neurodivergent children use devices, use social media as a way to communicate, as a way to emotionally regulate themselves. It can be an utter lifeline, as well as having that harm that's perpetuated on this. So it has to be a right balance. And I would also say that we have to do something around mental health in this country, which is why I'm so pleased that we announced today our policy of 8,500 new mental health experts in communities, one in every school, to actually tackle this problem, because it can't be kept ignored.
I mean, it's happening in schools already, to a certain extent. But do you agree with this collective approach?
I do. A couple of anecdotes. So my eldest son was probably one of the first people to get onto social media when he was about 12 years ago. And his whole behaviour transformed negatively, I'm afraid to say, because he was on Facebook all the time. And we as parents, first time, didn't really understand, frankly, what was going on.
Did you do anything about it, Richard?
It was really difficult because you had that real tension between your beloved eldest and you as a parent, frankly, grappling with all this new technology. So that was a problem. The second thing is actually, as a governor of a school that took the decision to ban smartphones, all phones actually, throughout the whole school day, it was the biggest single beneficial transformation in pupil behaviour in a secondary school in the Midlands. It was amazing. It was fantastic. I would strongly recommend it.
Well, on that, Jonathan, you want to come in?
Yes, what I just heard, that is what I hear from every school that does it. I've been trying to collect reports. I ask on Twitter, can anyone find a school that went phone free and regrets it? Nobody. It's transformative. Our kids are hooked. Our kids don't so in school, our kids are getting lonelier and lonelier. The PISA data set shows that since 2012, kids all over the world are feeling lonelier and lonelier in school because they come into school and what do? They sit on their screen. In between classes in the hallways, it's quiet. Everyone's on their screen. And what I hear over and over again from heads of school is when they lock up the phones in a phone locker or a Yonder pouch, suddenly it's like there's life again. It's like kids are talking and laughing, and they can pay attention to the teacher. So we have to see these devices. We have to see a smartphone is an experience blocker. As soon as you give a smartphone to a child, that will become the center of their life. That will block out almost everything else. They won't read many books, they won't have hobbies, they won't spend much time with other kids. So it's a big decision to give kids a phone. It will block out most of the rest of life. And for God's sakes, can't we give them 6 or 7 hours a day when they can pay attention to other kids and to their teachers? If they have all this digital technology and able to text, they don't pay attention to their teacher or to the kids next to them.
I mean, Jonathan, can I just put this headline in the Times? You've probably read the piece, which is about the outgoing head of the children's charity, the NSPCC, Peter Wanless. A smartphone ban would let tech firms off the hook. And he says that a ban on smartphones for children, let's say under 16 or even under 13, is an unnecessarily blunt tool. What do you say?
Well, as an American, the idea that the government is going to say that a parent is not allowed to give their kid a smartphone, that seems kind of strange to me. You know, my view is the Europeans tend to regulate with too heavy a hand. They don't care about dynamism. In America, we're sort of too far the other way. And my sense so far is that the UK is actually leading. The UK with the Age-Appropriate Design Code, the Online Safety Act. I think you are struggling to get it right, but you are leading. We're counting on you to get it right. Banning phones, I don't think, is the key thing. What we need to do is say that social media in particular, we're not going to keep our kids away from the internet, but a platform on which strangers can talk to your child and ask for photographs?
But also,
Jonathan, have a minimum age of 16?
There are different types of phones, like Wise phones, which actually where you can't put apps on unless they're approved by the parent. But of course, that doesn't suit Apple because it's selling the app, so it's got a huge conflict of interest. That's where the government and regulators need to come in.
Yes, I agree with that. That's right. Government can change incentives. That would help a lot.
It's also, I mean, I feel very strongly as one of the parents you describe who is freaked out by all of this, who's got a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, so we're very much navigating all of this in real time, is that a lot of responsibility has to lie with parents. And the school bit of the picture, absolutely agree with you. Schools can, you know, put away phones as children come in and give them back to them at the end of the day. You know, tech firms could bring in strict enforcement, but ultimately parents can still go out and buy their child a smartphone, one meant for over 16s, or put any apps on that they want. And it is, I do think actually, unusual for me to say this in Apple's defence, but there are a lot of, I mean, I have screen time on all of my kids' phones, which enables me to limit when the phone goes on and off, what apps they're allowed, how much of them are allowed to use a day. So like one of my sons is allowed YouTube for 10 minutes a day, and I'm really strict about it. My kids hate me for it, but I do think that not just in terms of accessing or managing your children's access to phones, it's not just phones, of course, it's PS4s and all the rest of it, but also in terms of making sure that they have that balance in their lives. You know, okay, kids, you go and play you go do some gaming for an hour, but afterwards you're going swimming, or you go to your park, you're friends with your park all morning, and only then will you be allowed to have a look at your phone. It's on parents. We're the ones who are in their lives day in, day out, night time as well. And if we don't take responsibility for our own children, then we can't expect anyone else to.
Jonathan, finally?
Yes, of course parents have responsibility, but parents all over the developed world are trying, many are trying really hard, and they're failing because it's an impossible task. Once your kid has access to the entire internet all the time, they're able to get around. We have to just get this out of the lives, especially of the younger children. In the UK, a quarter of your 5 to 7-year-olds are given a smartphone. This is insane. We have to stop.
Jonathan Haidt, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to return to our top story, which is that the First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, has resigned in the last hour, and talked to Nick Eardley, our political correspondent. Nick, what happens now?
It's a good question, Jo, because the SNP will be hoping that they can close this chapter pretty quickly. Hamza Yousaf's leadership didn't really get off the front foot at any point. It was pretty disastrous, ended with that power play gone wrong last week. Big question is how much of a leadership contest there is, how many people stand, and whether we saw what we saw this time last year, which was a big battle for the party's soul. For years, the SNP's divisions were kept in the background by Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond. They had a strong leader who could keep everything together. They didn't have that under Hamza Yousaf. There are splits in the party. There are candidates vying for position this afternoon from different wings of the party, and if that debate happens again, it could potentially be pretty bloody.
Just very briefly, John Swinney, Ian Blackford mentioned him as a safe pair of hands to take over. Any word?
If I was a betting man, the two names that would be on my slip would be John Swinney and Kate Forbes. I think Kate Forbes wants to stand, although whether that happens or not, we'll see over the next few days. John Swinney hasn't said for sure, but he's not ruled it out, and some of his allies think he's very close to being persuaded.
Nick Eardley, thank you very much on a big day in politics at the start of a very busy week once again. But that's all for today. Thank you to all of my guests and Jonathan Haidt. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer.